teacher. And when in the early 70s they began to take money away from education, and the question at the board very noticeably went from what do students need to what can they do without? What can we take away? Some of us said, well, what does this mean? We put forward very good proposals and the board is very enthusiastic about them, and then they say, but we can't afford it. Well, we don't have the money. Well, where did it ever come from? Where has it gone? Why is it that suddenly at this point we can't afford public education? When I tell young people today that I grew up very poor in this country, I mean really poor, yet I went to university for 5 years, and when I graduated, I didn't owe a cent. And that's the way it was, and that's the way it can be, and that's the way it should be. Money, the way we think about money, is a big part of our problem. You know, Tim Flannery, an outstanding Australian climatologist, wrote a book called Here on Earth. And in this book, he says there are so many misconceptions. For example, the misinterpretation of the Darwinian theory. And he goes on to relate that to economic thinking. The ideology, the neoliberal concept of humanity and of economics, as Maggie Thatcher expressed it, there's no such thing as society. Totally wrong. Totally wrong. And one of the things that we've got going for us today is that different disciplines, sociologists, anthropologists, physicists, I've heard all kinds of scientists talking about the economy in terms of what they know about humanity. David Graeber, for example, he's written a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Always been debt. But the relationship, as Dix has pointed out, it's all about relationships. And early societies and most societies got along in very different relationships, much healthier relationships. They were in societies where they could recognize the need to look after one another and to cooperate with one another. I think this is a defining moment in history. I think we've come to a point of complexity and human consciousness where transformation is inevitable, absolutely inescapable, and totally necessary if we're going to survive. Tim Flannery, talking about this misinterpretation of evolution, said, you know, it's not so much technology that's going to do us in, it's what we believe. And he talks about those misinterpretations, about neo-Darwinism, that is the basis for the current dominant economic ideology. And he says, either those ideas will survive, or we will. And in what you've been saying about where we're at and how we've changed and a lot of the things that you've said make me think very much of this. And young people often bring this to mind. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Teilhard de Chardin, but Teilhard de Chardin was both a paleontologist and a Jesuit. And he wrote a book called The Phenomenon of Man. And in that book, he traced the development of evolution, and he said, there's a definite direction in evolution. And that direction is in the direction of complexity and consciousness. And I think that we have arrived at this point of complexity and consciousness that makes moving on to something totally different, absolutely essential. You remember Einstein, that Dix was pointing this out up here a few minutes ago. Einstein said we can't expect to solve our problems at the same level of thinking at which we created them. And what we're about right now, I think, is moving to a whole new level of thinking. And you've already been expressing it. The new has been with us a long time. I've been here a while, and I can tell you, the new has been with us for a long time. And in fact, it is the crisis and the falling apart of the old that has us in such a mix at the moment. When I'm talking to young people, I say, you know, I don't think what you're about is revolution, and that has never worked very well anyway. I think what you're about is evolution. At St. James, when the Occupy people came and settled in St. James, I saw a whole new level of process going on. And I talked to many, and I was amazed really at how articulate some of those mostly young people were, how committed, how much they knew. They knew more in their early 20s about politics and economics than I did until I was well into my 50s. And by the way, I began to be politicized in the Canadian High Arctic, and I learned a lot there about values and about governments and about what we were doing to Native peoples. And if anybody owns that land, if anybody does, by God, it's the people who lived there for thousands of years and learned to adapt. If you ever went to that place, if you ever lived there in the middle of winter for a week, you would have such absolute admiration and wonder that any human beings could possibly have adapted to that environment. Well, I don't mean to ramble on, but first of all, the point I want to make is that we are at a moment of choice. And to me, it's very clear. Now, as far as money goes, we have breaking news for many Canadians, and it's not their fault that they aren't onto it already. It isn't their fault at all. But the breaking news is this. We own a bank. We have a right to money. Money belongs to us. Money is the right of everybody because that is the social convention of this society for the exchange of goods and services on which we depend in such a complex society. And we've been robbed. That bank has a duty under law to operate and to manage the economic affairs of this nation in the interest of the most healthy economic, the greatest economic health of the nation. That's what it's supposed to be about. It works, it belongs to you and me. You know, a little bit of history here. In the Great Depression, the capitalist system, of course, is flawed in all kinds of ways. But one of the greatest problems is that it lives in busts and booms. For various reasons that we can't go into at the moment, the system simply doesn't work. It never has worked for most people. It is dysfunctional, it depends on extortion, and it depends on waste, extravagance, all sorts of very bad things, and it doesn't begin with the concept of humanity. What is an economy for? It's for us, and it's for us to change. And money isn't, the most important thing about money today, in my view, is that money is not just a medium of exchange. If you take, I'm told, Economics 101 or whatever, you learn that it's a medium of exchange, it's a place where you can store, a way of storing value and all of these things. The biggest thing about money today is that it's a medium of power. This is about power. Now, there's nothing new about the human struggle for power. Power to own, power of ownership, power of control, but it has come to an incredible peak today. And it has been used as a strategy. It didn't just happen. Money and debt have been used to enslave all of us, to control all of us. And that is a part of a very deliberately and well thought out plan, first put in place to see that developing nations never got to develop. And now it's our turn. And what we're facing is the prospect of a global economic and political system that will put us all in our place. And what's happened in Canada, along the way in our struggle in Canada, back in the time of the Great Depressions, Canadians learned a thing or two about banks and banking. And things were done, and in the 1930s, we established a central bank, the Bank of Canada, and then in 1938, we nationalized it. We own it. We own it, you and I. And that meant that the government was able to borrow almost interest-free money. Now, if you look at a graph between 1938 and 1974, you will see that we had very little inflation, very little debt, and what we did owe, we owed to ourselves. We had stability, and we did all kinds of things with government-created money. When World War II broke out, and somebody said to the first governor of the Bank of Canada, how are we going to afford a war? Here we've been fighting a depression. How are we going to fight a war? He just chuckled and he said, I'll make the money. That's what banks do. Now here's the situation. Imagine this for absurdity. Imagine it for stupidity. Private banks are allowed, we allow them. It is not their right. It is a privilege that we have allowed them to create money out of thin air. And that's the truth. When I grew up, I learned two things about money from my mother. One was, there's never enough, and the other was, money doesn't grow on trees, you know. Well, imagine when I learned that it's even easier than that. You create it out of thin air, nothing to it. You just go to the bank, and if they think they can take you for the rest of your life, for everything that you earn and make and create, for the real wealth that you produce, they go to the little machine and go, doo, 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 doo. You go to your bank account, there are your statements, and suddenly you've got $50,000 you didn't have yesterday. Wow! Where did that come from? And it's you who turns that into money when you spend it into the economy. So, we came to quite a fairly good arrangement in Canada, and we used our central bank to create money, and we helped finance World War II, we helped look after the immigrants to this country who came after, we built the Trans-Canada Highway and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we did all kinds of things, and we produced a golden age, and we produced a middle class. And we were doing fairly well. And in the 60s, I would never have thought that we could go backwards. It would never have occurred to me. And in the early 70s, all that changed. In 1974, at a secret meeting, because they're all secret, at a secret meeting of central bankers, Canada, who had just become a member of the Bank for International Settlements, agreed, along with all the other central bankers, most of whose banks were private, that we would not use government-created money. And if you look at a graph from that time on, you will see that our national debt, in fact, all levels of debt, shot straight up. Straight up. And in fact, up to this point, Canadians have paid on the interest on the federal debt alone over $1 trillion.